Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Rhoads. I'm a graduate student, MPH graduate student here at the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy and Clinical Practice. I'm also the student leader of the Benjamin Rush Institute, which is the main sponsor of tonight's event. The Benjamin Rush Institute, or BRI, it's a national organization with chapters on about 20 different medical school campuses across the country. And basically the purpose of BRI is to promote informed discussion about important issues in medicine and to basically advocate for a healthy doctor-patient relationship. Tonight's discussion is the first of what we hope will be an annual spring event such as this. And if you're interested in joining or staying in touch with the kinds of events that we put on over the course of the year, let us know. At the end, we'll have some iPads in the back where you can sign up. Give us your email address if you'd like. I'd like to thank our faculty advisor, Professor Bill Nelson, there in the center, for his assistance in designing this event. And we'd also like to thank the Geisel Ethics Program for co-sponsoring this event with us. So the question for tonight is physician aid in dying, should it be legal? Physician aid in dying, sometimes it's called physician-assisted suicide. It's an issue that's been emerging since the 1970s in the U.S. Today, as a result of various legislative and state court decisions, some form of physician aid in dying is legal in 5 states: Vermont, Oregon, and Washington, and those are by way of legislative action. And then also in New Mexico and Montana, sort of by way of state court decisions. It's far from certain that this trend would continue, though. Although more and more states are attempting to pass legislation on this topic to legalize it, the vast majority of them are failing. Just last week, the Wall Street Journal, ran an opinion piece that listed many of the failed attempts. Some of them include Massachusetts, Maryland, Colorado, Connecticut, and that op-ed quipped that the physician-assisted suicide movement was, quote, going on life support. Americans in general are pretty split on the issue. A 2013 Pew Research poll asked Americans whether they approved or disapproved of laws that let doctors prescribe lethal doses of drugs to terminally ill patients to help them end their lives. The split on that was basically 49% disapproved, 47% approved, practically even. In tonight's discussion, we'll hear some different opinions about not just the legal question, but I think we'll also hear some different opinions about the medical and ethical and philosophical aspects of this question too, so it should be an interesting discussion. For the record, the Benjamin Rush Institute has no official position on this issue, nor does our chapter club. We're just doing this because we think it's an important and interesting issue, and that we like to encourage medical students and public health students to tackle these issues and look at them in depth. So on to our speakers. Professor Ronald Green is professor of religion and the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values at Dartmouth. He is also a faculty member here at the Geisel School of Medicine. He's done research in genetic ethics and biomedical ethics. He's authored 9 books and edited 4 more, the most recent being a book titled Suffering and Bioethics, published last year by Oxford University Press. So thank you for coming, Professor Green. Peter Schwartz is retired chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute, where he currently serves as a distinguished fellow. He is the founding editor of The Intellectual Activist, and he's written extensively on a variety of socio-political issues, including the Brittany Maynard case last fall. His latest book, which is actually being released tomorrow by Palgrave Macmillan, is titled In Defense of Selfishness, Why the Code of Self-Sacrifice is Unjust and Destructive. Thank you for coming, Peter. Dr. Robert Macauley is Medical Director of Clinical Ethics at Fletcher Allen Healthcare in Burlington, Vermont. and professor of pediatrics at the University of Vermont College of Medicine. His work focuses on clinical ethics, pediatric palliative care, and spirituality. He's an ordained Episcopal priest. He's received numerous awards in teaching and curriculum development, and he currently serves on the Committee on Bioethics for the American Academy of Pediatrics. So thank you for coming, all three of you. Tonight, each speaker will have 12 minutes to give an opening statement, and then we'll do a brief round of moderated responses, and then we'll go to Q&A. So Professor Green, you can go first.
I want to thank Jared Rhoads. I want to thank Jared for helping put this together. He brought a great deal of energy to the organization, and to the Benjamin Rush Institute and the Geisel School for sponsoring a program on such an important and current project. Let me begin by saying that I strongly support physician-assisted dying and legislation like Oregon's, Washington's, and Vermont's death with dignity statutes. A word about words. We're not using the term physician-assisted suicide tonight because suicide is a term fraught with negative connotations. So we're talking about dying, and in this case it's physician-aided, physician-assisted. I would support legislation that went further than these laws and permitted the use of self-administered medications to end one's life, not only when, as the laws stipulate, the patient's condition is incurably and irreversibly terminal and likely to result in death within 6 months. All the laws have that requirement. But I would support it as well in cases where a patient, though not terminal, is experiencing grievous suffering. I won't define that here, but I think we get the idea. An example is a patient experiencing advancing Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, who is not likely to die within 6 months, but who fears reaching a state where he or she may be unable to self-administer lethal medication. Another example might be the patient with advancing Alzheimer's, who sees the point when they can no longer make decisions about their life. Again, not necessarily terminal. So I would go beyond the statutes in this regard. Let me be clear. I am a firm opponent of physicians ever becoming agents of death, and I deeply oppose active euthanasia, so-called mercy killing, where the physician administers a lethal medication. I hold this position for at least 2 reasons. First, because I am against ever empowering one human being to kill another. It is one thing for medical professionals to cease aggressive care, but quite another to license them to kill. In the former case, cessation of care, errors of medical judgment, malign intent, or simple mistakes can unfortunately lead to the unnecessary death of someone who is gravely ill. But in the case of permitted active killing, the same problems, misjudgment, malign intent, or error, threaten all of us, even the healthy. In other words, there is a very significant difference between omissions and commissions. And this difference justifies permitting omissions, but not commissions. Or, to put it otherwise, it permits the cessation of aggressive care, but not active killing. So as a moral theorist, I want to stress this very important difference, and is a basis of my opposition to any form of active euthanasia. Second, I also oppose active euthanasia because I believe that it would be disastrous for the medical profession and for all of us if physicians became agents of death. The lessons of the Holocaust, which began with an active euthanasia program, are that once medical professionals become inured to killing, we have created a terrifying core of people whose very medical prestige facilitates murder of the vulnerable. For the same reason, I also oppose physician involvement in capital punishment via lethal injections. But as strongly as I oppose active euthanasia, I also support physician-assisted dying. In jurisdictions where physician-assisted dying is permitted, and where proper safeguards are in place to prevent mentally incompetent or otherwise ineligible people from securing access to lethal drugs, the only active role of the physician is to ascertain the applicant's eligibility for the appropriate medications. Then the physician gets out of the way. Physician-assisted dying does not empower physicians to take a life. It merely, and more properly understood, disempowers them and the government from stopping us from doing so to ourselves. It may seem odd to put it this way, but we must understand that the reason that you and I, as free individuals, cannot access life-ending drugs is because governments, usually for good reasons, have imposed rules that block our access to them and require prescription approval by physicians for such drugs. Hence, it is governments and doctors acting on their behalf who normally and wisely block our access to dangerous or lethal medications. Physicians here act as society's gatekeepers. But where physician-assisted dying is permitted, physicians withdraw from this role. They stop interfering with and hindering our free access to the drugs we need to end our life. They are not causing death by writing a prescription. We are the cause. Physicians merely get out of our way and allow us to do what we want to do. Physicians cease their active blocking efforts and literally do nothing. We are the ones who end our lives. I feel this is appropriate. Furthermore, I believe that people who are facing the end of life, terminally ill patients like Brittany Menard, as well as those suffering grievous and irreversible pain, should be allowed to end their life if they wish. This is a simple expression of respect for human freedom, autonomy, and dignity, and it is also an expression of compassion. I realize that there are many alternatives for people facing the kinds of medical problems that recommend physician-assisted dying. Certainly, the cessation of aggressive interventions or of hydration and nutrition, especially artificial hydration and nutrition. The provision of palliative care and palliative sedation and access to hospice care should all be made available as a first resort and even encouraged. But this still leaves a residue of patients who cannot or do not want to avail themselves of these alternatives. The ALS patient I mentioned may be an example. Experience with a physician-assisted dying in Oregon has shown that about a third of the people who go through the process of applying for it do not finally use it. This tells us that physician-assisted dying plays an important role in providing comfort and assurance that no one will be forced to suffer beyond what they can bear. There are many who, on religious or other grounds, oppose the taking of one's life in any form. I respect their beliefs, and I ardently defend their right to refuse to end their lives by their own hand. But mutual respect here also requires that we allow others who believe differently to end their lives in the way they see fit. A final thought. One of the identified risks of physician-assisted dying, in which the patient self-administers the lethal agent, is that it will possibly lead to more active physician involvement and slide us down the slope toward voluntary or even involuntary active euthanasia. The worry here is that there is a class of patients suffering who may be incapable of properly giving themselves the needed drugs. In such cases, it is said, compassion will urge a more active role for the physician, whose profession is committed to the relief of suffering. Interestingly, we hear similar arguments for physician involvement in the administration of lethal injections for capital punishment. I believe we should resist these arguments. For the reasons I have indicated, I think that we must never allow physicians to become agents of death. Nor is there ever in my mind a good reason to permit the active killing of an unconscious individual. If a conscious, terminally ill patient or grievously suffering patient who has clearly affirmed a wish to die needs assistance in ending his or her life, someone, for example, to hold the cup and steady the straw, I would rather see this done by non-medical professionals, as is the case in Switzerland, where a carefully monitored organization, Dignitas, involves qualified laypersons as assistants, but not agents, in the dying process. I acknowledge the worry here about sliding down the slippery slope, but for the reasons I have offered, I believe this slide need not occur, and that the worry about it is not in itself a compelling reason for resisting the type of humane legislation passed in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. Thank you.
Mr. Schwartz?
The opponents of suicide regularly bring up the point that life is precious. So you shouldn't be allowed to willingly end it, neither by you nor by a physician. But I believe it's precisely because life is precious, because your life is precious to you, that you should be allowed to determine its course. You should not be compelled to endure an existence that is no longer precious to you. If life has lost its value and you wish to end it, if life has become not a source of pleasure but of pain and suffering, then your decision to end it should be categorically supported. Now, I am fully comfortable using the term physician-assisted suicide. I think we should name it for what it is. A person wants to end his life. That's suicide. We want to know whether that's good and whether it's good for a physician to assist in that decision. But if we leave the question of physician-assisted suicide aside for just a moment, it's important to understand why you should have an absolute right, a moral right, to end your life if you so choose. Now, those against it say that your life is not entirely your own. They invoke a certain code of ethics. Which code of ethics? The code of altruism, of self-sacrifice. You have a duty to others, they say. You need to sacrifice perhaps for your family, society, for God. You can't think just of yourself. Now, this argument is particularly made by religionists, such as the Pope. They say that life is a gift from God. So you're not really the owner. God gives you the orders and you have to obey. You don't really have rights. What you have are duties. Life may become hopeless and intolerable to you. Nonetheless, it's God's will that you remain alive. And you must sacrifice in order to implement that will. But whether the basis of this is secular or religious, we're all taught that self-sacrifice is a virtue. We're taught that you should subordinate your desires to others, whether society or God. Taking your life is selfish and therefore unjustified. And on the premise of altruism, that is perfectly correct. The only way to justify a right to suicide is to reject that premise. The only way to uphold a right to suicide is to say that your life is, in fact, your own, and pursuing your self-interest by doing what you think is best for you is actually something good. Now, what do I mean by self-interest? I mean your rational self-interest. I don't mean going around victimizing other people. I don't mean acting like an amoral predator, such as Bernie Madoff or Attila the Hun. A life of parasitism is contrary to your actual interests. What I mean by rational self-interest or rational selfishness is honestly pursuing your goals, producing, not stealing, producing your values, and not surrendering them to the wishes and needs of others. Now, a person who commits suicide is acting selfishly. There's no way around that. He is doing what he decides is best for him. He's not sacrificing to others who may want him not to commit suicide. His premise is that his life is his own and that it does not belong to his family, to his community, or to the state. He believes that he has a moral right to live in a way that he judges is best for him, and to die in a way that he judges is best for him. There is no way to defend this view unless we acknowledge the moral fact that his life belongs solely to him. Now, once this principle is established, then the issue of physician-assisted suicide is just an application of it. If you have a right, a complete right, to end your life if you so choose, then you have the right to have someone voluntarily cooperate with you. Is this killing if the doctor assists you in suicide? Is it killing? Yes. Is it wrong? No. The only reason killing is wrong is because it's a violation of your rights. You want to live and somebody's taking your life away from you. But it's your life, and if you decide you no longer want to hold on to it, then there is nothing, absolutely nothing wrong in somebody assisting you in that decision. He is providing a service to you, a benefit to you. Now, obviously, a person making such a decision needs to be of sound mind. He needs to be a competent person. It can't be just some irrational impulse of the moment. You know, some teenager high on cocaine goes to his doctor and says he wants to die. Obviously, the doctor should not comply. But once it's clear that the person making the decision is of sound mind and has made a thoughtful decision, there should be no other restrictions. Let me repeat that. There should be no other restrictions. There should not be a 6-month waiting period, as Dr. Green said, and I agree with that. There should be no restriction. There should be nothing said in terms of how much pain you may be suffering, whether it can be alleviated by other means. Any condition you're in that you decide is no longer tolerable to you, and you wish to end your life, a doctor should have a perfect right to help you. Now, is the physician harming the patient? No. It's the patient's values that are primary here. Now, for example, a patient may be given medication with some very undesired side effects. And the patient decides, well, I'll take the medication because the positives outweigh the negatives. If the doctor gives him that medication, he's not harming the patient, he's helping the patient. And the same with suicide. The patient decides that the negatives of living outweigh the positives. He refuses to endure a condition like that. If the doctor does not help him in that decision, the doctor is harming him. Now, what about the claims of potential abuse? I think those, grandma may be pressured into making the wrong decision by her, heirs who want to speed up her death to get her estate. This is all a red herring. All rights fall in that category. You can make the same argument against anything. You have a right to buy a car. Well, what if you're going to be pressured into buying the car that's wrong for you? You have a right to marry someone you choose. Well, what if you're being pressured into marrying the wrong person for you? The law has one proper function: to prevent you from being a victim of force or fraud. And fraud is just a type of force. When there is fraud, whether you're buying a car or getting married, the government can step in and stop it. But there needs to be evidence of fraud. You cannot deny rights simply because you can imagine some scenario where an abuse can take place. If you could, then we'd have no rights left at all. Now, to quickly end this, when it comes to assisted suicide, the physician has to ascertain that the decision is willingly and freely made, and then he should have no restrictions on helping the person. He should be encouraged to help the person as part of his duty to help his patient. Is this a slippery slope? Is the next step to kill the elderly and the mentally ill? No, it's the opposite. This is premised on the idea of individualism, where you have a right to your life. If you don't want to relinquish that right, whether you're sick or ill or whatever, no one has a right to take your life away, no matter how much they may claim that society benefits from it. The principle of individualism is your best protection. But there is a slippery slope in the opposite direction. If you can be forced to stay alive against your will because supposedly society benefits from this, then why can't you be forced to die against your will if society supposedly benefits? You know, what prevents people from saying you're too old, your existence is a burden on society, we need to get rid of you? On the altruist notion that the individual must be sacrificed for the collective, such action would be perfectly justifiable. And the wider implications are, consider the wider implications. If the government has the power to say you're making the wrong choice in dying, it can say you're making the wrong choice in living too. So you have a paternalistic, authoritarian government telling you it knows what is best for you. You can't have trans fats. You can't have large cups of sugared soda. You can't live in a house without a carbon monoxide detector. Can't ride a motorcycle without a helmet. All of these things are part of the same premise. Any restrictions on assisted suicide take us further down that dangerous path, and we must instead remove those restrictions and allow the patient to decide for himself and allow the doctor freely to assist in that decision. Thank you.
Dr. Macauley?
So thank you all for coming out tonight. So I'm going to sort of start with some simple kind of categories a little bit. Specifically, to say what I don't think we're talking about tonight, and then move on to what we are talking about. So we're not talking about, which may have already been made clear, we're not talking about the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, which is well codified in the law. And interestingly enough, the reason it's well codified in the law is because we made a big, bold line back in the 1970s between, as Professor Green noted, the acts of omission and the acts of commission. We said there is a right to die. There is a right to die literally by acts of omission, what used to be called passive euthanasia, and thankfully we've moved beyond that to a term of letting people die. We allow that. So one interesting question is that if we now, after having split those two, to say it's okay to let someone die, if we now, because that's not making someone die, now if we say it's okay to make someone die, which is a point that I do believe physician-assisted dying is, then it raises the question, are we going to lose that consensus around the acts of omission being okay? And this is also not a discussion about the right to die with dignity. I actually really dislike that euphemism. To me, it's a political tool because who wouldn't want to die with dignity? And I think there are a lot of people who die with dignity in all sorts of ways, based on how they die, sometimes receiving maximal treatment if that's what they want, sometimes by virtue of refusing certain treatment, and that's what they want. So I think there are lots of ways to die with dignity, and we should all focus on that. So we are talking about physician-assisted dying, and I have to confess that I'm a little sad that we're talking about it. The reason for it is it's a great topic. It's a great ethical topic. It spurs lots of good conversation. But as a palliative care physician, the fact that we're spending time talking about it, I think, is a distraction from the really important stuff. So in the United States, less than half of people who die with hospice care. About a third of people die in the hospital, which is usually where people don't want to die. Those who are on hospice care usually are on hospice care for 3 weeks or less, and half of them are on hospice care for the last week of their life or less. So let's just say we have a lot bigger fish to fry, and sometimes this can be a bit of a distraction. Ira Byock, who's formerly here at Dartmouth, famously said that the debate about physician-assisted dying is like two guys having a fist fight outside a burning building. And their focus is, I'm going to beat the other guy up, and oh, by the way, there's a building burning behind me, but I'm not going to focus on that. So maybe I would say we put down the boxing gloves, turn around, and try to douse the flames, because we have a big problem. All right, so what are we talking about? So we are talking about the right of a patient who is not assessed as incompetent, who has a life expectancy of less than 3 years, who is likely not in any pain and is not worried about being in any pain, to obtain a lethal dose of a pharmaceutical. Now, at this point, you're probably saying, this guy's got his facts mixed up, right? Where does this 3-year thing come from? Where's this competency thing come from? So let me explain that. That stuff comes from the best data source that we have in the United States, which is Oregon, where physician aid in dying has been legal has been practiced since 1997. So let's take it in turn. Competence. We've heard a lot of focus on voluntariness from both of the first two speakers, that this has to be a voluntary request by a competent patient. So how do we know the patients who die in Oregon by physician aid in dying are competent? Well, neither the physician who first examined them or the second opinion physician has deemed them to be incompetent or to lack decisional capacity. Studies have shown, though, that oncologists who deal with dying patients a lot say, I'm not qualified to assess a patient's competence. I'm not good at it. At most, I'm going to pick up on it about a third of the time. So that's why, if there's a concern about competence, that patient has to be referred to a psychiatrist. But the majority of psychiatrists say, I can't tell whether somebody's competent from one visit. I won't be able to tell that. And fewer people are being referred to psychiatrists. In the first 5 years that physician aid in dying was legal in Oregon, 16% of patients who died from physician aid in dying, 16% were referred for a psychiatric opinion. That's in the first 5 years. Last year, 3%. So we're not looking for competence. And even if we were looking for it, we wouldn't see it and try to be able to understand what it is, even if we did look for it and understand. So we're not sure if the patients necessarily are competent. Now, how about prognosis? The law says prognosis 6 months or less of survival to be qualified for physician aid in dying. The data in Oregon show that from the first request, you got to wait 15 days based on the waiting period. From the time of first request to death of those who died from physician aid in dying in Oregon, the range was 15 days, which is the logical minimum, to 1,009 days, which I'm pretty sure is more than 6 months, which actually is like 3 years. Now, I don't mean to say that there's anything nefarious going on. I'm just saying that doctors are bad prognosticators. Usually we overestimate prognosis. In this case, somebody really underestimated prognosis. So we shouldn't talk about patients in the last 6 months because that may well not be true. How about pain? We heard about suffering. I'm going to talk specifically about pain for a second. Only 24% of Oregonians who've died from physician aid in dying have said that pain or even the possibility of pain was one of the reasons they chose to die that way. So the numbers 1, 2, and 3 reasons all have to do with autonomy, dignity, and self-control. So if you want to have a discussion about what to do with someone in extreme pain, we can have that discussion, but that's not the discussion we're having now, because that's actually a fairly small minority of patients who are reporting that. And I'm also going to be very specific about using the term pharmaceutical as opposed to medicine. Just as suicide has a very negative connotation, I think medicine has a very positive connotation that in terms of healing, and so I'm going to use pharmaceutical as a technical term. All right, so some concerns I have. One is consistency. I was really struck by how much I agreed with the 2 previous speakers had mentioned, because I think that the reason one would support physician aid in dying is because of a combination of self-determination and compassion. Patients have the right to make their own decisions, and if they're suffering, we have to have compassion for them, which are both very noble things, self-determination and compassion. Logically speaking, though, self-determination and compassion don't say anything about a 6-month life expectancy. Like if you go with self-determination and compassion, then anybody should be able to access this law. You shouldn't have a 6-month maximum life expectancy. Nor, I would argue, should you have to be able to self-administer. Like, why are we discriminating against somebody who's paralyzed from the waist down? Like, if you really take this at its face value and are consistent, if we say self-determination plus compassion equals the right thing to do, then anybody who wakes up this morning and says, I'm done, I'm suffering in whatever way, they should be able to get a lethal prescription. I don't know why we have a waiting period. I don't know why we have a life expectancy limit. I don't know why we have to self-administer. So if we want to take it to its logical conclusion, we should do that. And I'd invite you to think about what society would look like if we did do that. So my sense of why we have those requirements is, number one, the 6-month waiting period is we've now inserted a value judgment. We're not being purely consistent. We're not saying it's self-determination and compassion. We're saying within the limits of our societal values, and our societal values are 6-month life expectancy. We're willing to have somebody live less than 6 months longer than they would have, or shorter than they would have, but we're not willing to let them die 20 years before they otherwise would have. That's a value judgment. As soon as you make the value judgment, I would argue you've stepped onto the slippery slope, and now you're going to start sliding. I think the reason for self-administration is that's a way of being assured that the patient is voluntarily acting, because if they're actually doing it for themselves. But if we're really sure that they're voluntary, and here I would disagree with Professor Green, I think this is exactly the same as euthanasia. I think euthanasia is much more efficient at getting the job done. You can do it very quickly. You're not going to discriminate against somebody who's paralyzed. This is a broader way of achieving the same goal. So a quick word about the slippery slope. Folks have said, well, we're not going to slide down the slippery slope. The problem is we've seen that a little bit in Oregon in terms of psychiatric evaluation, and we're clearly seeing it in the Benelux countries who have had various forms of physician aid in dying or euthanasia longer than we have, at least in the case of the Netherlands. In Belgium, depressed teenagers can receive euthanasia. In Holland, impaired newborns can receive euthanasia, which is clearly not voluntary, right, if you're a newborn. So we're seeing the slippery slope happen in a laboratory that's broader and has had more time to develop. I also want to talk about who this law benefits. So if you think about the law in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, which all have sort of similar requirements, people will say, well, it's going to benefit the people who end their lives this way. We need to be clear, those numbers are very small. Like if you were to take New Hampshire's population, in the first year, if New Hampshire were to pass this law, you'd have about 6 people get a prescription and about 4 people die. I don't mean to minimize the importance of those 4 to 6 people, but the numbers are small. But then people will say, well, it's not just them, it's the assurance to know that if you get to that point, you'll have the opportunity to end your life that way, that sense of control. And I think that's a fallacy for a couple of reasons. One is, I've talked a lot in Vermont as this law was being considered, and I had people say, well, if I get so demented that I can't make my own decisions, then I want to use that law. And I'd have to say, sorry, like even if the law passes, you don't get to use it. because you're not going to be able to make a competent decision in real time. And I had many other people say, well, if I put in my advance directive, that'll make a difference. And I'll have to say, well, no, that's not what the law says. So there's that. Thank you. The second thing is, data in Oregon show that if you go to a physician and say, I want a prescription, only 18% of patients will ever end up getting the prescription. They'll either change their mind, they'll be disqualified because they don't meet criteria, they'll die before they can get the prescription based on the waiting period. So if this is viewed as an insurance policy, I may not want to use it, but if I want to use it, at least I know it's there. That's an insurance policy, right? And we all have insurance policies, like life insurance, car insurance, home insurance. If you get into a car accident, what do you think the chances of your insurance company paying off are? You'd like to say 100%, right? Like that's why you bought insurance. This is an 18% probability of an insurance policy paying off. I'm not sure how reassuring that really is. And who else does this affect? I think it affects everyone involved in a doctor-patient relationship. I'm a palliative care doc. If I say to a patient, how can I help you? I mean one of three things. How can I help you live longer? How can I help you live more functionally? And how can I help you live more comfortably? Three things. You know it, I know it. In Vermont, though, now maybe there's a fourth thing. Maybe. What am I really saying there? Am I saying, do you want me to help you die? Are you ready to die? Do you want to talk about it? Do I want to talk about it? Now we're introducing a level of complexity that makes me profoundly worried. My last point is, we talk about this debate about physician aid in dying. I actually agree with some of the comments that were made earlier. I'm not sure why the P is there. Where's the physician piece come from? This is my question. I'll just warn you, Professor Green, this is my question for you. I'm not sure how a physician writing a prescription, which seems very active, is literally doing nothing. That seems like I'm doing something when my hand's moving. Why not take the physician out of the mix? Why not have the physician say, I certify that you have 6 months left to live, or less. I certify that you're competent to the degree that I'm able to do that, and I'm done. And then maybe there's another organization, thanatologists or some kind of specialists out there, who say, now we're going to administer this lethal dose of a pharmaceutical. Don't put it in the physician-patient relationship. Take away the imprimatur of the distinguished and honorable physician and make it just a service that somebody provides. That safeguards the physician-patient relationship, but I also wonder what it means for the act itself. If you take away the sort of blessing of the physician, does that change how we as a society view this practice? And does that make us a little more skeptical about what it means for us and how we live our lives? Thank you very much.
Thank you, all three. This next portion, it'll be a brief portion where it's a little bit more fluid, where we'll have some responses going down the table here. Professor Ronald Green, you heard Dr. Macaulay's question right at the end about the participation of the physician. What do you respond to that?
Let me say two things about that. First of all, I think there is an optical illusion at work in our discussions here, and Dr. Macauley has evidenced the optical illusion. That seems very active to me, he says. We think of the physician writing the script as killing somebody. But what I'm urging, and the whole center of my argument, is that's not the case. What the physician is doing is essentially getting out of the picture in order to allow you or somebody in your place in the Dignitas situation, others go to the pharmacy with the prescription and get the prescription. The physician's really not, he's stopping what he ordinarily does, which is preventing you. He's been put into a position of holding the gate closed. And when we think of physician-assisted dying, the physician is stopping that. The stopping is not itself active. He's stopping his act of opposition. So I think we have to keep that important optical illusion in mind that is often advanced against physician-assisted dying that makes the physician the active person. Now, Dr. Macauley has said, well, why not just get the physician all the way out of the picture? Well, we can't, because our laws everywhere require the script be written by the physician. I can't ask Jared to go and pick up some lethal barbiturates at the CVS for me. It has to be done by a physician. We could change that. We could say for certain purposes, it would be good that there's a paramedical corps that could go and do this. But frankly, I want to keep scripts in the hands of physicians. They know what they're doing. They know the risks and dangers. I don't want to empower a group of people to actually access lethal agents, some of which they could misuse for homicide in that way. So yes, the physician is inextricably involved in this picture, but the physician is not acting. The physician is ceasing to act. Let's understand that difference. If we don't, you can forget about all my remarks, because it's the center of what I tried to say. While I'm here, let me just make one other major point. There's a peculiar agreement between Mr. Schwartz and Dr. Macauley. They both seem to think that the reality of physician-assisted suicide should be extended or could be extended in some way. Why not the depressed 18-year-old? Right? Now, as I read, as I heard what Mr. Schwartz had to say, he wants to say, why not the depressed 37-year-old who wants to end her life? Why shouldn't freedom and autonomy extend to that person? Or somebody who's just lost their job and they're unhappy, or whatever. Why not? And Dr. Macauley has said, if the reality of these laws, since it's going to go to 3 years in some cases, why not 20 years? Why won't it go? Let's get real here, I want to say. We are not going to empower unhappy 37-year-olds to take their lives easily. And we're not going to do it because we're reasonable human beings who are compassionate. We recognize that people in despair and despondency, in serious life reverses, are prone to take their lives. And we have established in all humane civilizations obstacles to that for good reasons. We want people to take some time when they've faced serious reverses in life. We're not going to go there freely for any reason of suicide. This is why we have imposed such, even religious traditions which have added the whole structure of religious beliefs, all try to make people pause and stop and think and not make suicide something easy for people. But to say that doesn't mean that we don't have a valid series of situations where people can end their lives. And what these laws try to do is spell that out. Whether they limit it to 6 months and terminality, or in some jurisdictions expand it a bit for grievous suffering, they're not opening the door to the 37-year-old unhappy person who wants to go to the doctor and get a script. And I think it's right that they're doing that, and I'm not afraid that that is going to happen as well, because we are reasonable people in society. So I think I've made my point.
Mr. Schwartz, is that
Yeah, can I answer part of what Dr. Green said and pose a question
absolutely.
to Dr. Macauley?
Yep.
I think there is an absolute right to take your life if you decide to do it. The question becomes more complicated when there's a second party involved. Now, it could be a doctor, it could be anyone else who's assisting you. If I know somebody, you say a 37-year-old depressed woman who wants to take her life, I would not automatically go along with that decision. I would want to know definitively that this is a well-thought-out decision, that there's rational basis for it, that it's not just some impulse, that it's not just because she had a bad day or a bad week at work. And then if I were convinced that this is really a permanent state of hers and that she no longer finds life tolerable, no longer wishes to go on living, if I were convinced of it, whether I'm a doctor or not, I would then seriously consider helping her. And I think it should be, the doctor's judgment as to what the patient's condition is. These are red herrings, because what we're discussing here are clear-cut cases. We're discussing cases such as the one of Brittany Maynard, which I want to quote in a second, where a person is in an irreversible situation, maybe she has 6 months to live, maybe she has 2 years to live, maybe she has many years to live. It's not our job to impose our terms on whether a person and under what conditions a person wishes to continue living. There can be many good reasons that a person wants to commit suicide, even if they're not in tremendous physical pain or if they're not within 6 months or whatever of dying. And you have to respect that. What you have to, though, is make sure that it is a thought-out decision if you want to decide to help that person. So I don't see the problem there. I would like to ask Dr. Macauley this question. I sense, despite what you will say to the contrary, it seems to me that you are really not sensitive to the plight of the individual who has good reason to commit suicide and is looking for someone to help him or her. So, for example, you cite the problems of ascertaining competence. And you say a doctor may not be qualified to determine whether a person is competent. A psychiatrist may be, but maybe one visit isn't enough, and so forth. The point is, what if we're talking about a situation where it is clear the person is competent, and can I just take a minute to quote a statement from Brittany Maynard. Many of you may know of her. She was a 29-year-old who committed suicide at the end of last year. She and her husband moved to Oregon. She was suffering from inoperable cancer, and they moved to Oregon because that was one of the states where physician-assisted suicide was permitted. And let me just quote this and ask a question based on it. She said, quote, "Even with palliative medication, I could develop potentially morphine-resistant pain and suffer personality changes and verbal, cognitive, and motor loss of virtually any kind. Because the rest of my body is young and healthy, I am likely to physically hang on for a long time, even though cancer is eating my mind. I probably would have suffered in hospice care for weeks or even months, and my family would have had to watch that." Close quote. And she made a final, eloquent, poignant plea. She said, quote, "My question is, who has the right to tell me that I don't deserve this choice?" She had a physician prescribed barbiturates to end her life. "Who has the right to tell me that I don't deserve this choice, that I deserve to suffer for weeks or months in tremendous amounts of physical and emotional pain? Why should anyone have the right to make that choice for me?" Close quote. Are you sensitive and sympathetic to this kind of dilemma which can be resolved by a physician assisting in that suicide? And she clearly was competent.
So I have to say, is this on? Someone asking a palliative care doc if they're sympathetic to human suffering, those are kind of fighting words, so I'll take them as they come. So I think that it's a really interesting shift of the question. So the question of the debate is, should physician aid in dying be legalized? So the question I think Mr. Schwartz is asking is it ethical for a physician, or would one feel compelled as a physician to try to help Brittany Maynard in her suffering? Two very distinct questions, so I'll answer the one that I was asked. I think from all I read about her case was a tragic case. She seems like an incredibly thoughtful, brave person. And I think, and I've had experience with this over the last couple of weeks for a variety of reasons, in the sense of, like, I've read different books on the pro side and the con side. The pro side, in terms of legalization, they have much more emotionally wrenching arguments. Like, the pro arguments are, let me tell you about a patient and how much they suffered. And the con side is, let me make philosophical argument about physician-patient relationships. Like, one is a lot more compelling. So what I'm going to say, and I really do believe this is consistent, is that, yes, I believe that in certain cases it is ethically and professionally permissible for physicians to assist patients in hastening their death. And no, I do not believe that it should be legalized. Now you may say, well, that's interesting. there are certain things that are so sufficiently rare that even though they can be right in sufficiently rare instances, they should still remain outside the societal boundaries. And this is not an original argument. Paul Ramsey, who was one of the fathers of bioethics, made the same argument. There are certain things like, is stealing ever right? Yes. Like if my kids are starving, I'm stealing. So I'm not sure if now we should say that there's no private property based on that statement. I think it's probably a good idea that we say as a society that stealing is still wrong. But there are times when we break society rules, but only in situations where the need is that great, and maybe that's what physicians need, rather than saying we're not going to refer for psychiatric evaluation because we've become a little complacent in Oregon. Maybe what we should say as a physician is, am I willing to take a risk for my patient? Do I care that much? Is this that case? And if so, we're doing this together.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting answer. At this point, I think we have enough, probably enough people in the audience to turn to audience Q&A. We do have some mics at the back. It's at the back column there. And we'll pass around the mics. If you could just raise your hand to indicate if you have a question or not. Thank you.
One point I haven't heard addressed so far is that if individuals had the right to end their own life, if they found no joy in it, and if that choice was available through a physician, what if that choice became especially favorable to certain segments of the population, like, for example, homeless individuals who might be ill, whose problems could be addressed in other ways? What's to prevent that option being favorable and available to certain already disadvantaged segments of the population?
Would you like to pose that to the panel as a whole or any particular speaker?
As a whole.
I think you're raising a legitimate concern. If we put physicians in the role of addressing dysphoria, people who are unhappy, and dispensing life-ending medications, will we begin to see even commercial enterprises, medical enterprises, that cater to that kind of need? And again, these are standard concerns, the pressures on the vulnerable and the like. I don't believe we should expand our conversation about physician-assisted dying to anybody's right to die. Mr. Schwartz has done that a bit, and in a funny sort of way, coming on the other side, Dr. Macauley has raised the same point with worry. But we're talking about legislation that is very narrow and confined, even if somewhat expanded in different jurisdictions. We're not talking about opening this up. And frankly, I'll be very blunt, there's no need for it. If somebody is very unhappy in their lives because they're homeless, sadly, or because they just get no pleasure in their life, there are many ways they can end their life. They don't have to involve the medical profession in that at all. So there's no reason for making this a part of medical practice in any way whatsoever. And I think we should avoid moving in that direction for the reason you mentioned, which is the potential for abuse in terms of justice and society, but also because simply there's no need for it.
Anyone else? Special concerns or considerations if it becomes more prevalent in a particular population? Oh. Other questions?
Okay, sure. All right, this question is directed towards Dr. Schwartz. So just to kind of overview my thinking, you base your argument on a categorical right to end your life, and one of the assumptions of that is the distinction between competence and incompetence. And you said if you are competent under these qualifications, you defended some sort of euthanasia law. In response, Dr. Macauley came up with a response saying that, well, most psychiatrists have very difficult times distinguishing who is competent and incompetent, to which you responded a really great anecdote about a recent case of, here is this patient who is clearly competent and really wants to end her life. Why can't we permit that? To which Robert Macauley responded, well, that seems somewhat, there's a distinction there between a moral view and a legal view. And now the onus seems on you to defend why you would think a moral view can apply legally as a law for euthanasia. If, given this case of this pregnant woman who seems competent, who seems like she genuinely has authenticity to commit suicide, what is your argument for making that moral view into a legal law?
All right, well, thank you. It's Mr. Schwartz, not Dr. Schwartz,
Sorry.
by the way. But thank you for the honorarium.
The degree.
Upgrade.
The basis for any law is always some moral view of right and wrong. A proper law, certainly. What else is the law based on except a view of right or wrong? Now, they're not synonymous. There are things that are morally wrong that should not be illegal. You know, I think it's morally wrong to spend your life dispensing horoscopes to people or reading their palms, but it's not illegal as long as, you know, the customers know what they're getting into. In this case here, the first thing you've got in discussing the legality of suicide or physician-assisted suicide, you've got to first establish what is morally right and wrong here. Now, there are people who think that suicide is morally wrong, categorically. The Pope certainly believes that. So I'm trying to determine, to argue that there is a categorical right to suicide because it's your life. And then when it involves a second party, again, whether it's a doctor or someone else, I don't see a crucial distinction between. When a second party is involved, that party has to be convinced that the person making the decision is actually making a proper decision, is making it not just out of some momentary whim, not out of impulse, not because the person is no longer mentally sane or competent to make the decision, or because he's not a legal adult. All of those things need to be determined by that second party. I don't see the point, though, of saying that the case of Brittany Maynard is an exception. And in most other cases, doctors should not be allowed, or Dr. Macauley says even in her case, the doctor should not be legally allowed to do it, which means that in order to help her, in order to do what is right, in order to do what is morally right, you have to become a martyr. You have to risk being fined or go to jail, lose your medical license, whatever. And that's a grave injustice. I don't think the state has a right to penalize doctors for helping in cases such as hers. Now, where in fact there is a situation where that the person's competence can't be determined, okay, then let's leave it in abeyance until you can determine it. But as I said, I think this is a red herring because what we're talking about are cases where the person is competent, the doctor determines that there is a legitimate reason behind the person's decision to end his or her life, and the doctor would like to help that person, and the only thing in the doctor's way is the law, and the law therefore should be changed to allow the doctor to do what is moral so that it can also be legal.
And as a moderator, can I just ask, so Dr. Macauley, Mr. Schwartz raises the point of there's a concern now what happens if a doctor under the scenario where it's illegal but morally, that scenario that we're talking about, what kind of protection does a doctor have if that were to take place? Is there a board that things get, a non-legal board that reviews these kinds of things? I mean,
so historically, in situations where physicians have aided their patients in dying in a situation where there was no law to protect them, generally speaking, they may have been prosecuted, but they haven't been convicted or indicted. But I think the point goes to the sort of poster children of both sides. So Brittany Maynard is the poster child of the pro side, right? Like thoughtful, informed, visible, articulate. The poster child for the con side is somebody who's not in any pain at all, who might have years to live based on a faulty prognosis, who might have questionable competence that is not discerned by the physicians taking care of that patient, not referred for psychiatric evaluation because very, very few are, who would probably benefit from palliative care, which they refuse, who might benefit from family support, which they have not informed their family of their situation. And so I think the question as a society is, if you open the door all the way, then you can't let Brittany in and then close it before the second person walks through the door, right? Like the door opens. The law is a blunt instrument. You put forth criteria, and if you meet the criteria, then you get to use that law. So we as a society, I think, have to decide, do you open the door and allow the poster child for the con side to walk through, which a lot of us, I don't think Mr. Schwartz, but a lot of us would say that's not such a good idea that that person takes their life. Or do you keep the door closed, but then you say we're going to keep this in a situation where we as a society do not sanction it. But we recognize that there may be exceptional cases, and there have been famous exceptional cases. But in the benefit, overall health of society and physicians and patients, we don't think that we can open that door because we're afraid of the cases that might come through that we don't think are supportable.
Can I intrude here to say I think this is a false comparison? On the one hand, you have a person of unquestioned eligibility within the scope and meaning of the law itself, Brittany. On the other hand, you have an individual whose eligibility is a result of misapplication of the law medically because an error has been made in prognosis. Now, I understand that can happen and is inevitable to some extent. But the problem lies at that focal point of the law. This is not, these are not parallel situations where people are representing a normative option within the law. It's really a failure of the law to act properly, and it should be corrected. I don't think it's fair to put these as two equal poster people in terms of the law.
And I would respond to that by saying that the law is predicated, if one of the criteria of the law is a medical prognosis, then and that's one of the supporting functions, like, it's one of the legs that the law stands on. If that leg is wobbly, I think the law gets wobbly.
Well, we should repair the leg and make certain, if your concern is valid, that this happens as little as is reasonably possible, not get rid of the law.
Well, if we want to do that, then we should make physicians better prognosticators. So let's make that our project, and we'll come back in 50 years and see how we're doing, because we've been working on that for a while. Physicians really are not good prognosticators. I think that's inherent in the wobbliness.
Question over there.
I have the perfect scenario for you, which is true. My grandmother is 94, and over the last couple of months has become basically a quadriplegic from very bad spinal stenosis. Before that, she was living alone. This was just in the last few months. So she's done. She's a delightful woman, but she has had it. She can't do her crossword puzzle. She cannot feed herself. She's a total care patient. Unfortunately, she's extremely healthy. So she is currently in a nursing home waiting to die, waiting for pneumonia, waiting for something to set in. She's not taking any medication. She doesn't want to go to the hospital. She's a DNR. But she could go on living for quite a while if she's well cared for, and that's not what she wants. She's done. And she's church-going, like anybody's grandmother, and she's in no pain, which is, thank goodness for that. But no one will help her. I said, we'll have to move you to another state. She's in Massachusetts. But what I don't really understand about our society is that we're forcing her to live, a woman who's at the end of her life, who has nothing to look forward to other than getting sicker and sicker and sicker and suffering until she does die of natural causes. And she's at a nursing facility, which is, even the best ones are very bare-boned. Care is minimal, staffing is minimal. It's not a good life. She doesn't want to be there. But yet we say we don't want to dispose of people just because of cost, but we're not spending anything on them while they're still alive and sound mind and competent to take care of them and give them at least a good end of life. She doesn't want to be fussed over. She wants it over. And it's amazing how we could have this and somebody telling her, she's mad too, that she can't have anybody helping her. And why aren't things different? And yeah, I just think it's like, that's your scenario. I'm not talking slippery slope, but really, like, why wouldn't anybody help this woman? She could say goodbye to everybody in the family and die peacefully.
Okay, thank you for the comment.
Can I take that?
Sure, if you want.
Yeah, I think you're making a good point, and I don't think that that's such a unique situation. I think there are other situations like that. And what I'm troubled by is this. I think most people, I don't want to speak for Dr. Macauley, I don't know, you say, you know, Brittany Maynard was an exception. I don't know if you think that would be another exception or not. But to argue that the kind of case like the one you're talking about should be, physician-assisted suicide should be illegal because we have these other cases where the doctors make a wrong prognosis or the doctor judges someone to be competent and the patient isn't, and there are mistakes. What that amounts to is saying that there's someone, the people who genuinely deserve our help, our sympathy and our help and our recognition of their right to make a decision about their lives, and the people who are making a reasoned, understandable decision, we have to make them suffer, we have to abandon them, we have to ignore them for the sake of the people who will fall through the cracks or the people where doctors make mistakes. And that is a very unjust premise. It's like saying, and I don't mean to ascribe this to Dr. Macauley, but to take it to an extreme, it's saying, in effect, a person can make a proper, rational decision to end his life, but we're going to prevent him from doing that. We're going to prevent the rational person from being autonomous, because maybe some irrational person sometime will fall in the crack and be given a life-ending drug when he shouldn't be. You're penalizing people who deserve help for the sake of people being given this kind of assistance who shouldn't be. And that's wrong. Let us focus on, we know what the criteria for help should be, as the case you described. If there are errors in other cases, if there are wrong prognoses in other cases, deal with that. Don't simply say, let's forbid everyone from having this because sometimes someone who shouldn't get it will get it. That's a very unjust way to treat the people who are deserving of our assistance.
I forget who was next. Oh, I think you were, yes, go.
Is this working?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I almost hate to shift gears a little bit, but I would like to refocus on the fire behind the people who are fisting. And I'm wondering if you're alluding to what Atul Gawande said in his wonderful book, Being Mortal. He's concerned that in countries where the focus has been on assisted death, that in fact, society forgets to pay attention to assisting people to live a higher quality up until the end. Is that where you were going with this, Dr. Macauley? Or?
Well, I think, so people have made that argument about if with assisted death, then there isn't sufficient attention to end-of-life care.
Palliative care.
I'm not sure that argument really holds super great.
Yeah.
Like Oregon has excellent hospice enrollment, but I think that one of the concerns that people have in situations where assisted death is accepted is the concern for the vulnerable, in the sense of those who can't make decisions on their own or may be compromised. We haven't seen that in Oregon, but Professor Green earlier, I think, said something like the reason that we won't provide assisted death to patients who are depressed is because we are reasonable people in society, I think is what he said, which makes me wonder how we would describe people in Belgium who do that. Like in Belgium, if you're depressed even as a teenager, you can qualify for euthanasia. So if reasonable people won't do that, then that's a pretty broad classification of Belgians. Hope there aren't any Belgians in the room. Like, it has happened. So I think that my bigger thing, I think, is I have a suspicion, and the folks on the panel can correct me if I'm in error, that a lot of this comes from your view of human nature. If your view of human nature is folks are generally good and you get out of their way and they'll generally do the right thing, then you'll probably be in favor of aid and dying, I think. If you're a little skeptical about human nature and you think that things that look kind of good at first turn out not to be so good, and once the sort of concern of society and the review of society is no longer focused on it, then we start blurring the boundaries and going outside the lines a little bit, then I think you might be against. And that may go a little bit to your comment about whether or not people are generally well-intentioned or whether there's sufficient concern about that, about abuses, that could be reason to be cautious.
I can understand that Belgium's value system may be different from ours, but our country is a very diverse country, and it's really hard for me to imagine and project, and I bet for any of you to really say if all 50 states would handle the laws in the same way, and if the social values structure of those states would play out the same. I'm at a loss to even speculate that. I'm glad to have the questions asked.
I wonder if I could come back for a moment to the question about the elderly individual woman. Was it your aunt?
My grandmother.
Grandmother. I said in my remarks that I support an expansion of this legislation beyond terminality, beyond the 6-month stipulation. For what I use very loosely the word grievous suffering. Now, obviously that would have to be fleshed out in any change in the legislation. But I would put into these classes an individual like your grandmother who has really come to the point where she no longer wants to live, and it's not an unreasonable thing to request in her case. This is not the 17-year-old girl who was jilted, right? We see those differences. I would extend that as well to the person with rapidly advancing Alzheimer's, who sees very soon the inability to make any competent decisions, and who doesn't want to live in that condition, and by the way, be a burden on loved ones in that regard. Now, I invoke that because there is always here the problem of coercion. Granny, we'd really like to get at your inheritance, right? Don't you want to die, Granny? And so on and so on. But what I think if you go back and look at these laws, they're not perfect, but the laws really try to put restraints and limits within them. Two requests: medical examination, the opportunity to back out, the clear presence of individuals who are independent of the family in ascertaining the voluntarity of consent. That's where we should be building legislation that prevents and protects against these abuses and misuses. You wanted to say?
I just wanted to say that spending, if you go, how many people have spent a significant amount
not saying that by any means we should just kind of off everybody who becomes a burden for total care. But if you walk the hallways over and over again and you actually meet the people and you can ask them, are they content, are they happy being there? And I know everybody has their opinion, but I would say that the majority of people that I've met there don't want to live, but they're being forced to. They're being forced to get sicker and sicker and sicker until they can die on their own. And no one's taking good care of them, and they don't want to be cared for. They don't want to live this way, and we're forcing them to. And and we tuned it out. We don't visit. We put them away, and we don't give them any money to these places to give good care to the patients. It's just not right.
So if I could just say one
Sure.
thing. It's, I think, important in the grand scheme. There have been mentions tonight about various things of euthanasia, physician aid in dying. There's mention of palliative sedation. The one thing that I don't think has come up in our conversation so far is something known as voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And to give an example, a very well-respected physician colleague of mine, when he was in his 90s, was told he couldn't drive anymore. And he said, that's it for me. I've lost my independence. And he said goodbye to his family, and he stopped eating and drinking. I won't go into great detail. Some people look at that as sort of barbaric and use the term starvation. You don't actually die of starvation, you die of dehydration. And studies have shown that with optimal hospice care, that patients who choose to die through voluntarily stopping eating and drinking actually have lower symptom burdens than those who continue with hospice care. So I don't mean to say that it's a walk in the park or make it all sound frilly and stuff, but there are patients who do choose that. I realize it's difficult, but I just wanted to make mention of that.
There are several states in the United States, including New York, where you have to feed someone if they cannot feed themselves.
Well, I'm not talking about if they cannot feed themselves. I'm talking about someone who chooses not to eat.
Okay, what I'm saying is now the law in several states, including the one we're sitting in right now, that if you are the caretaker for someone who cannot feed himself or chooses not to feed himself because they say that's what I want, you have to feed them or you can be prosecuted. I would like to add.
Okay. All right. That's
Okay. This happened some years ago with my mom. It happened at Dartmouth, Hitchcock. Yeah. She, at 83 years old, decided she needed to hasten her death. She stopped all nourishment and all medication. We met with the ethics board that consisted of about 15 people. She was put on morphine, increased morphine. It was a good way for her.
Okay. Next question. Alex?
Quick question for you.
Go ahead.
For the whole panel, my question is...
Can you use the mic, please?
Commit yourselves to the...
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah.
I don't like mics. Okay, so anyway.
It's being
if
recorded.
you commit yourself to the idea that patients have a categorical right to pursue physician aid in dying, do they also have the flip side? Do they have a categorical right to pursue life-sustaining therapy? And if not, why?
Yes, they do. They have a right to pursue aggressive treatment if they want it, I would say.
I would agree with that. Why would they not have a right to do that?
If, say, perhaps after several rounds of failed chemotherapy, it was contraindicated.
Well, medical contraindication is a little bit different. Like if somebody says, I want a treatment that they say, I want this so I will survive, and you know that it will kill them, then you shouldn't do that for them. But I think we should just pause for a moment and just reflect that the three panelists all agreed on something, so that's kind of a cool thing.
Thank you very much. Yes. Next question. Right.
Yes,
and I think we
I'm
have
a pediatrician,
probably
and
time
I'm
for a
gonna
couple more. Go ahead.
Ask from a different point of view. You've all emphasized how important competency is. There is obviously some good, and you've all agreed, at least in some situations, even Dr. Macauley, that there are situations that deserve an opportunity to end their life in a more rapid fashion or in a dignified fashion. What arguments do you use not to allow children to have this benefit? It has always bothered me to see children suffer we take their parents as their advocates and as their decision makers, and I don't understand why the incompetent should be denied a right now in many states and the privilege of dying a dignified death in a more rapid fashion.
Well, I'm not a doctor here, so maybe the doctors could address that more ably. But the point with a child is that a child has rights, but he's not able to exercise all of them for himself until he becomes an adult, and the parent is the proxy for exercising the child's rights. The parent has an obligation to keep the child alive. Now, you have Christian Scientists, for example, who refuse certain medical treatment for their children, and they're prosecuted and properly prosecuted, because when you have a child, you are obligated to do whatever is normally reasonable to keep the child healthy and alive. In the situation you're talking about, I assume you mean where the child is sick and he's put on some kind of extraordinary life support, and if he were an adult, he could choose, say, do not resuscitate, but he's a child and he can't choose that. Should the parent be able to choose that for him? Am I stating this situation properly? Yeah. Well, you see, that's a very difficult moral question to resolve, because the assumption is that the child wants to live. Just as the parent has a right to starve himself, he has no right to starve the child. He must feed the child. Even a healthy child, you can't just let him starve to death, because you are obligated to care for him until he's an adult. And the same applies to medical conditions. The assumption is the child wants to live, and the parent should make a decision, should be required legally to make a decision based on that. So I don't think in a situation such as the one you're talking about, that a parent should have the right to say, do not take extraordinary measures to save the child.
I guess
So,
I think there's a different obligation that parents have, and that's to do what they feel is best for the child, and the state may disagree.
You need criteria for it, but the parent can't say, I think it's best, for the child to have only, bread and water every day and be locked in a closet and be whipped every day. He can't say that, because objectively that's harmful to the child.
I think we're kind of we have different conversations happening. So I agree with Mr. Schwartz that you need to treat your child with respect and care. But from a pediatric perspective, a pediatric patient who's dependent on life-sustaining treatment, it's a gut-wrenching decision, obviously, for the parents, but the parents are tasked not necessarily with doing whatever is going to keep the child alive the longest. They're tasked with doing what they believe is in the child's best interests. And there are times, more and more, where parents are saying that this patient is suffering and we will withdraw or withhold life-sustaining treatment, which is fully supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics and palliative care bodies. There are times of discretion. There are times where parents say stop, and the state will say, well, no, actually the chances of survival are good enough that that's not appropriate. But parents clearly have the right to limit life-sustaining treatment in situations where they feel that it does not provide overall benefit for them.
I agree with you that. It's really the first example you gave that I would be more, that my comments are more addressed to, where the state would come in, because they say there is some slight chance of success. Yeah. You got to take the chance.
Your question is a very appropriate one. I think it's been addressed in different ways by the other speakers. Let me point out that it is the case that parents are required to act on the best interest of the child. And it may well be that the child's best interest is to die at a certain point. That next step of taking a medication that ends one's life, as opposed to ceasing aggressive care, as opposed to palliative sedation, which comes under the umbrella of comfort care and easing of suffering. All of those things parents can authorize and do without. But the next step that says we are going to administer to this child who likely doesn't understand or know what is happening here, a lethal agent, is such a step, is such a big step. And the assumption of parents working for the best interest of the child is frayed at that moment because of parents' potential conflicts of interest. They want to get out of the situation as much as... So I would, as a bioethicist, thinking on my feet, I would say that's a step perhaps too far. And that what we want in those cases is to say, yes, the parents are authorized to permit the cessation of all forms of aggressive intervention. They're certainly permitted to authorize sedation and the like. But parents themselves cannot authorize the administration to the child of a lethal medication. And that's probably where I'd want to come out on that situation.
I agree with him.
I think we can do two more if we're relatively quick. Over there, and then you.
So 2 years ago, my 90-year-old father was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and rather than go through the very difficult treatment, decided he would stop eating and drinking. He went on hospice care. My parents had been longtime members of the Hemlock Society and Compassion and Choices, and they tried to investigate whether he could get something from Compassion and Choices to end his life. And because they lived in Virginia, that was not possible. So I cared for him at home for it took him over a month to die. It was very peaceful. It was very positive. And, but interestingly, 4 daughters, when we were talking about the possibility of getting medicine to kill him, 2 daughters said that they could help him, and 2 of us said we couldn't do it. And I don't know why. But my question is, under these laws, are physicians compelled to write that prescription?
No, they're not. So a physician is under no obligation to participate or is under no obligation not to participate. It's fully voluntary. Speaking for Vermont law, very specifically, a physician cannot be sanctioned by his or her organization or employer for participating or not participating either. But healthcare facilities like hospitals can say this won't happen on our premises. So, which I think is if they can choose to do that, which our hospital has, which is sort of a practical thing, you know, like from a facility point of view, to say that we won't have people taking lethal doses intentionally on our premises, but they can do so at home, which is actually what the law is meant to do, really, so to allow people to die at home, not really in a hospital.
The laws also, just for your information, typically state that for purposes of insurance and criminal prosecution, this is not suicide or homicide. So the laws are carefully knitted to try to protect and prevent abuses and make possible the real freedom of choice of the patient at the center of it.
One more question?
I think
we'll do 2 more questions, okay.
I think I understand where Mr. Schwartz lies as far as the basis of law, an individual's right to make his own decision, moral right and wrong, determining, you know, whether something's illegal or not. So I would like to know fundamentally where the other panelists stand, how they stand as far as the basis of how they determine what they think should be illegal or legal. Is that too broad?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not. I think that I would agree a great deal with Mr. Schwartz. Laws designed to prevent us from harming one another. Not every harm. If you break up with your boyfriend because you don't like him, I hope he's not your boyfriend. He is. Law doesn't criminalize that. It looks at serious harm, breaches of contract, physical harm, violence. But somewhat differently from Mr. Schwartz, I believe that laws are sometimes paternalistic. Laws sometimes seek to protect us against ourselves because we do such foolish things, right? Against Mr. Schwartz, I am a motorcycle driver, owner, and I support completely helmet laws. Not on the grounds that the helmet protects somebody else from my harming them, but rather it's foolish to drive such a big machine with exposing the most sensitive parts of your body. And I would extend that to many other things. This is why this is why people have argued for building high fences on the Golden Gate Bridge, to make it hard for people to easily jump off and end their lives in moments of despair. I think we do this. Think of it, if you will, as the law working as a kind of insurance policy, which we create to protect ourselves against our worst decision-making and judgments. Now, we can have very fine arguments about whether that is needed, how high should the fence be, and so on. But I think that's the principal difference between someone like Mr. Schwartz and myself. Harm, including self-harm, when that harm is truly ill thought out and injurious, and so on. I don't believe in a complete freedom to govern your own life at every moment.
Can I just quickly interject?
Sure.
I think it's kind of puzzling to me, because what you're saying is you're driving a motorcycle, you seem to be a rational, intelligent person to me, but you're saying to yourself, I'm too stupid to know I should wear a helmet, but I'm smart enough to elect these officials in government, these bureaucrats, who are going to decide something I'm incapable of. They're going to decide what really is in my interest. Now that is giving power to the government that is ultimately dangerous.
It's not, I'm not asking them to protect me. I would wear a helmet in New Hampshire. I do wear a helmet. I don't take the helmet off when I come over from Vermont to New Hampshire. I would wear it anywhere. But what I'm worried about is the 18-year-old who thinks herself invulnerable and immortal, and who likes the wind in her hair, and has never seen what happens when you hit a patch of water in a powerful motorcycle. I want to protect that person against themselves, and I'm willing to gamble on the legislature of Vermont and New Hampshire to make that point.
Well, that's an extensive discussion. We'll have to have another debate on
Another
that.
debate, yeah. Mr. Macauley, Dr. Macauley, do you want to weigh in? You did talk about human nature, different views on that earlier.
I think I would substantively agree with Professor Green on this. I think that if you look at the law as extremely narrow, as essentially protecting your individual freedom, that's a very elegant position. As soon as you start talking, as Professor Green and I have been doing, about protecting you from yourself or benefiting society as a whole, then it gets messier, I think, because then you got to figure out exactly how much you're going to do that and to what degree you might compromise individual liberty. So I think that we might be in a little bit different places on that spectrum, but I think we're on that spectrum together.
And the last question here?
So I just finished serving 10 years in the New Hampshire legislature. I represented Lebanon for the last 10 years, and I can guarantee you that the New Hampshire legislature will never vote for a mandatory helmet law. So I also wanted to let you all know that one of the interesting things that's happening down in Concord is that over the last 10 years, there have been increasingly interesting bills that have focused on end-of-life decision-making. And in the spring of 2014, there were 9 different pieces of legislation that were introduced that had to do with end-of-life decision-making. And I think that we're going to see this more and more because people are really demanding that state policy start to address some of these very difficult issues. I have to say that some of the things that were brought up are, if you were a policymaker and sitting in a hearing, one of the things that you would hear consistently is the objection to physician aid in dying from NAMI, New Hampshire, the Alliance for the Mentally Ill, for the Disability Rights Coalition, from the Catholic Church, and also from hospice. Consistently, those groups of people have objected to really the progression of any kind of conversation around physician aid in dying here in New Hampshire. And so I think in the future, though, I think people are going to start to demand that we address this more and more seriously. We haven't been able to even pass a study committee on this issue in the last 2 years because people just don't want to even talk about it. I think that that's something that everybody needs to consider. And the other thing is I wanted to respond to the comment about our advanced directives here in New Hampshire, and I don't want anybody to leave this room thinking that you cannot document in your advanced directive what you want at the end of life relative to hydration and nutrition. Absolutely, you can say that you do not want any kind of life-sustaining nutrition or hydration. And it's really important for people to understand that. And if for some reason somebody is saying, no, we're going to feed you anyway, then that's a policy having to do with the facility. It has nothing to do with state law. It is a requirement that we respect people's advance directives in all of the states right now. And so I'm concerned that that's been your experience. That is not the intent of the law. You should be able to document exactly what you want at the end of life relative to nutrition and hydration.
Thank you.
By the way, thank you very much for a really interesting panel.
Great, and thank you. I would like to would like to end it on a question. That is a great comment, though. Does anybody have one last quick question that we could? And then we'll make it a wrap. Okay. Okay. I guess Mina? No. Okay, I think we're okay. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to, if you could join me in a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you. Dr. Robert Macauley, Mr. Peter Schwartz, Dr. Roderick Green, and thank you to the Benjamin Rush Institute. That's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.